If Labubu is not necessarily based off of Pazuzu or any kind of demonic entity that we found, what is he based off? As we said, he was inspired by Celtic mythology, and he said clearly that he based the idea off of elves and fairies in Celtic mythology, which are conflated creatures that are kind of trickster creatures in the woods. So let's just do a quick backdrop on elves and fairies and see what we can find about that. If you just look into the history of elves, Celtic style, not like Lord of the Rings elves, you can see that it had lots of affiliation with things like pagan gods. Sometimes it seems to refer more to groups of people, and at the point in time where we're translating Latin into English, it was used in place of the Latin word for nymph, which has a lot of kind of influence on where it comes from. So it has a lot to do with kind of this feminine idea of elf beautiful, as it says here. And it compares it to biblical characters like Sarah and Judith, which is really interesting. In Middle English and early modern Scottish evidence, while still appearing as causes of harm and danger, elves appear clearly as human-like beings. They become associated with medieval chivalric romance traditions of fairies, and particularly the idea of a fairy queen. A propensity to seduce or rape people becomes increasingly prominent in the source material. Around the 15th century, evidence starts to appear for the belief that elves might steal human babies and replace them with changelings. That's at least weird too. Every time we go down a rabbit hole about this, you get into this kind of idea of targeting children. So Lamashtu is targeting babies, elves are targeting babies, and is Labubu targeting babies? It's causing problems with kids and babies. I mean, that was why it was banned in Iraq. So there just seems to be a lot of stuff going on here with kids and babies, and that's at least interesting. So you heard mentioned in that article that elves were pretty closely affiliated with fairies in Middle English and Celtic mythologies and things like that. So in Celtic cultures, fairies, also known as brownies, elves, selkies, or pukas, are known collectively as a group of creatures called the Fae. All of these can be mischievous and even dangerous, as well as cute and clever and helpful. So you very much see the similarity to Labubu when we're talking about fairies. This idea of fairies is not what we see from like Tinkerbell. It's actually this idea of like mischievous spirits who appear cute, clever, and helpful, but are actually mischievous and even dangerous. If you read down about the origins of fairies, various folk theories casted them in the Christian tradition either as being demoted angels or demons, or as deities in pagan belief systems, as spirits of the dead, or as prehistoric precursors to humans, or as spirits of nature, all of which are pretty interesting to me. Most academically, according to some historians, such as, I'm gonna butcher this, it looks French, Barthélemy d'Herbelot, such as that guy, fairies were adopted from and influenced by the Peris of Persian mythology. Peris or Paris were angelic beings that were mentioned in antiquity in pre-Islamic Persia and as early as the Achaemenid Empire. Peris were later described in various Persian works in detail. A Peri was illustrated to be fair, beautiful, and extravagant nature spirits that were supported by wings. This may have influenced migratory Germanic and Eurasian settlers into Europe or been transmitted during early exchanges. The similarities could also be attributed to a shared Proto-Indo-European mythology. So the idea that these fairies and these Persian angels or demon creatures are the same thing and they're affiliated with one another is interesting to me in the development, and at least one historian thinks that they literally developed from there. You heard mention of the demoted angels idea from this Christian tradition, where it held that fairies were a class of demoted angels. The story described a group of angels revolting, and God ordered the gates of heaven shut, so those still in heaven remained angels, and those in hell became demons, and those caught in between became fairies. Others wrote that some angels, not being godly enough, yet not evil enough for hell, were thrown out of heaven. The concept may explain the tradition of paying a tithe to hell as fallen angels, although not quite devils. They could be viewed as the subjects of Satan. So they're saying that this idea of there being these middle creatures, fallen angels, as you see in sort of traditional depictions, being different than demons or the rulers of hell, kind of has this idea of this middle territory creature. King James, yes, that King James, has a dissertation on demons, and he stated the term fairies to refer to illusory spirits or demonic entities that prophesied to, consorted with, and transported the individuals they served. In medieval times, a witch or sorcerer who had a pact with a familiar spirit might receive these services. So we're getting a lot of tie-in here. Even from ancient times, there's been the idea of fairies and in-between creatures being conflated with angels, demons, and other things in between. So even if we go back to Labubu being inspired by Celtic mythology, the idea of elves and fairies, even if the creator, Kasing Lung, means that genuinely, if they do happen to be creatures that are, by their very nature based off of something that we would consider evil in the Christian tradition, then it would still be demonic, if that makes sense. Furthermore, a recorded Christian belief of the 17th century cast all fairies as simply demons. And this perspective apparently grew more popular with the rise of Puritanism in the Reformed Church. They give this example of a hobgoblin, which was originally this mythological household spirit, which became classified as a wicked goblin. Dealing with fairies was considered a form of witchcraft and was punished as such by the Puritans. They give this example of in William Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, the king of the fairies states that neither he nor his court fears the church bells, which the author and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis cast as a politic disassociation from fairies. C.S. Lewis makes it clear that he himself does not consider fairies to be demons in his chapter on the topic, where he calls them the Longaevi, which is the long livers, from his chapter in The Discarded Image. Just because I love C.S. Lewis, and he also is sort of a authoritative figure when it comes to ideas of mythology and things like that, which he was a student of and incorporated greatly into his works like the Chronicles of Narnia. If we look a little bit into that passage, in which he refers to them as the Longaevi in a book called The Discarded Image, he said he avoids the term fairies because it's tarnished by pantomime and bad children's books with worse illustrations, which is a bit interesting. He takes this term Longaevi from Martianus Capella, a Neoplatonic philosopher, who mentions that dancing companies of Longaevi would haunt woods, glades, and groves, and lakes, and springs, and brooks, whose names are pawns, fawns, satyrs, sylvans, and nymphs. So we have more of a kind of mythological tie-in there, and going back to that nymphs term that we mentioned earlier. C.S. Lewis suggests that the medieval mind understood them to be inhabitants of a kind of middle realm between the physical and spiritual regions, which relates back to what we said earlier. Lewis posits 4 theories about them, sort of mentioned in the article that we looked at earlier. First, that they are this third rational species distinct from angels and men, quoting a 17th century writer that their nature is middle between heaven and hell, and they reign in a third kingdom, having no other judgment or doom to expect forever. This is sort of the idea of trapped spirits, the trapped spirits of the Nephilim, which in the tradition of people like Heiser that we've talked about on the channel, you would have demons essentially just being these trapped spirits in a third space between heaven and hell. They have nowhere that their spirits belong. So that's always kind of been a traditional idea. Lewis further breaks them down into these ideas of nymphs, sylphi, nomi, and salamandre or volcani, which is a little bit deeper than we're going in this category, but that gives you things like nomi, which are related to gnomes, which are like dwarves. There's another medieval writer that he mentions that says the Longaevi are demoted angels, a band of spirits who did not totally join with Satan's rebellion, but who were antagonistic to the Almighty's reign. They were assigned to a middle realm, a half existence between angels and men, to be relegated to Inferno on Doomsday. A third theory is that the Longaevi are dead, ghostly spirits. On death, it was supposed that those who did not go to heaven or hell may end up in fair elfland, which is sort of interesting. And the final opinion is that the Longaevi are simply demons, which would be the idea at risk today, I would say. This is the prevailing view from the 17th century onwards with those Puritans that we mentioned in relation to the Protestant Reformation and the subsequent rationalism of the Enlightenment. It seems to be sort of a more logical approach that all of these things could fall together, and I think the supernatural world that I mentioned earlier, that if we look into what the Bible says about it a little bit more specifically, then coming up with this idea of what actually would these middle creatures be, and if these middle creatures are to be affiliated with things like elves and fairies, and that's on which Labubu is based, then is Labubu based on a creature that is actually demonic, or at least a fallen angel, or some sort of hellbound entity of some sort? The answer seems to be possibly yes. A few other denotations from early church fathers could be seen, but it's important that universally Christians have been negative or skeptical regarding creatures like fairies or nature spirits. Some of them have said some things ambiguously about them in positive terms, and there's this example listed from Origen, who says in the year 248, "We also indeed maintain, with regard not only to the fruits of the earth, but to every flowing stream and every breath of air that the ground brings forth, those things which are said to grow up naturally. The water springs in fountains and refreshes an earth with running streams, that the air is kept pure and supports the life of those who breathe it, only in consequence of the agency and control of certain beings, who we may call invisible husbandmen and guardians, but we deny that those invisible agents are demons." So interestingly, Origen, who has a lot of interesting perspectives, has this interesting perspective where he says that there are these middle creatures that seem to be governing over things like aspects of nature, but they aren't necessarily demons, which is sort of interesting. He doesn't tell us what they are. However, shortly afterwards, we have Athanasius of Alexandria saying that it is exclusively negative, where he says in On the Incarnation that they are simply demons, taking up their abode in springs or rivers or trees or stones and imposing upon simple people by their frauds. So that's at least only 200 years after Christ. We can go back and source the idea of fairies, nymphs, or in-between creatures being associated with simply demons. So we're not to draw a full throttle conclusion about Labubu, but it's interesting that the basis on which they were based does seem to be demonic in the history of the Christian tradition, and that is Celtic mythology. If mythologies are to be taken seriously, then they are seriously part of a tradition that is not Christian. And so could your child have of any kind of fairy or any kind of being from mythology as a toy in their house? I don't know. Is it possible that Labubu is directly infused with a demonic entity? It's always possible, but it's hard to say precisely and for certain. If you enjoyed this video, please consider sticking around with the channel. This has been Creed's Questions, and I am thrilled to have had you. I ask that you would please leave a comment, like on this video. Let me know if this is something that interests you, more topics like this. If you think there's a deeper bit to it that we need to go further. And if you're interested in more of a history of how these mythologies and all of these kind of practices relate, then you should definitely stick around, because I have some interesting content coming up on the channel soon where I'm going to be discussing these things in detail in much of a similar fashion, where we're talking about ancient ideas of the occult and mythology and how these things things go back further than people think and how they are all connected. And you can't split them up and say, oh, that's Babylonian and that's Greek mythology, because in fact, they're conflated a lot more closely than you might think. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around with the channel. Again, this has been Creedence Questions, and I thank you so much for watching.